This time on Poll Hub, racial prejudice in the age of Donald Trump. If the conventional wisdom is that racism has gotten worse, there's new data that suggests it has perhaps not. We'll compare this with the increase in reported hate crimes over the past couple of years and try to explain what's going on. Then, are you a model thinker? No, that doesn't mean you spend all your time thinking about models. It's a way of looking at the world that's gained a lot of attention lately, and we'll talk with the author who started it all. Will this then be a model podcast? Unlikely, but we can always hope. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion. One day we should shift order of this because people know what's coming. No surprise.
But this was all pre-taped until you did that. It was all the same one. We do the same one every time.
I know.
It's never actually changed. It's the first episode of Poll Hub.
Not true.
Not true.
Clearly not. I said in the open the conventional wisdom, and certainly this may not be everybody's conventional wisdom, but I think there's a conventional wisdom that incidents of racial violence, perhaps racism, perhaps prejudice, have increased or at least are more visible in the era of Donald Trump. And I'm not doing causation or correlation here or anything like that.
Okay.
But there is that sense that has happened or is happening. But there's a really big study here, a really deep study that's gone and asked questions about Americans' prejudice, how prejudiced Americans are about race. And I think it flies in the face a little bit of some of that conventional wisdom.
Well, you're right to say that there is this overall perception that that at least extremist views on race have gotten more of an airing in the time of Donald Trump. And we have some survey data which suggests that public opinion talks about that. So we have a Quinnipiac poll where we see that a majority of Americans believe that, certainly the presidency of Donald Trump has emboldened bigoted views. And that's subjective opinion about what people are thinking, which talks about that. Pew has done a number of national surveys which have also shown that people have a negative perception of how race relations are going, and that a pretty similar proportion of people feel that Donald Trump has made those feelings worse. And certainly that most people also do feel through surveys that the expression of racist views has increased. So that has been quantified. There's been lots of surveys that have shown that. Now, the survey that you're talking about, that's just out of the University of Pennsylvania, Dan Hopkins, along with, I believe it is one of his research students, Samantha Washington, did a study which has gotten a lot of attention, which was a longitudinal study.
And what is that? Just to stop what that means for people.
It means that the same questions were asked over a period of time, actually 12 years. It's 2008 to 2018, but we count it as 12 because you're counting the year of 2008 and the year of 2018. And it was done with the Knowledge Networks panel, which is a probability panel that was developed around the time of 2007, 2008, where they randomly selected people throughout the country and asked them to participate in this panel. They answer the questions online. If they do not have online access, people in this panel are then given some kind of device to allow them to do surveys online.
So this is a panel that you are more comfortable with than the non-probability panels that we've been talking about in other episodes.
Absolutely. And I think there is a distinction. Certainly there are issues with panels where you have drop-off, but they studied these questions, and the questions, they used some very basic questions which we use not only in public opinion, but in the study of prejudice. So the two main questions they asked were about work ethic and about trustworthiness. And they specifically looked at how non-Hispanic white Americans would rate Hispanic or Latinos and African Americans on these two measures of stereotypes. So Worthek was a 0 to 100 scale of whether someone was hardworking or lazy. And the same thing on trustworthy. Are they trustworthy or untrustworthy? And these are pretty standard measures of prejudice that has been used over time in the literature. And so they tracked this over this 12 years, and what they did find was that there had been a decline in prejudice, in the sense that
that's measured,
as that more non-Hispanic white Americans had a greater belief in the fact that both Latinos and African Americans are more hardworking and are more trustworthy.
which is why this gets such a huge headline. In the age of Trump, prejudice drops is so counterintuitive to what's going on. But I think when I was reading through some of this, I was taken by that this doesn't really deal with concrete behavior and some different attitudes about whether you feel that racism has increased or decreased. Do you think it's gotten better or worse under Trump and other things like that? But it deals with people's sort of sense of their bias.
But isn't that a better way to measure prejudice? I mean, if I ask you, are you racially prejudiced, even in a poll where they don't see you, the odds are...
You know what the socially acceptable answer
right,
is.
I know, right. But if you ask these questions that are somewhat coded, if you will, right,
Mm-hmm.
I would think you would get a more honest answer. What strikes me about this is that this runs counter to another trend, which is a rise in hate crimes that has happened over the last 2 years of the age of Trump. What's interesting when we looked at that data is that while reported hate crimes have increased, and increased substantially in one survey of the top 100 police departments, especially in the last year, it's accelerated the increase. The report of the number of unreported hate crimes, which we can talk about in a second, has dropped significantly. So some researchers believe what's happened is people are more, not maybe more comfortable, but more powerfully motivated to report hate crimes in this era. So on one hand, we see hate crimes going up, maybe, or at least people wanting to report them, it being much more something people are top of mind. On the other hand, we see prejudice declining in this study. They do seem to indicate two different kind of paths.
Well, in an interview in the Washington Post, the authors of the University of Pennsylvania study had a couple of thoughts. And the one is that the decline has been over the 12 years, and although there's been a dramatic decline during the presidency of Trump, the decline occurred before then, and they point to as you have mentioned, the reporting of hate crimes and the attention that a lot of the police events have had, and the public airing those have had on the public itself.
Whether it's Ferguson or Charlottesville, or
exactly.
But see, I think they may be tapping into something a little bit different. I mean, I like longitudinal studies. I like things that are, you get good trend data, over time, because you can back and when you did another survey, you asked the same questions, but also the population in the country is changing, and we know that the millennials are, more tolerant of things. And I would be surprised if the population was getting more racist.
Couldn't they do regression analysis? Couldn't they hold constant for that?
Well,
or did they?
I didn't see anything in the written study that controlled for age, but I think that is a good point, because over a decade you do have that change.
Sure.
The other thing is that when you're looking at the population really as a whole and their attitudes on a particular issue, in this instance prejudice, it's accounting for Americans as a whole. It's not accounting for the discussion and the noise and the perception about what is happening.
Of what's acceptable.
A few voices being the loudest.
Exactly.
And therefore the perception comes from the few voices.
And I think also the effect of social media, and particularly what is expressed on social media and the attention that that does get, so that you have an extremist minority of people who may be emboldened to express these opinions, and they now have a vehicle for doing so.
Yeah, which is why studies like this can't be done in isolation from the times in which they're being measured and measuring people. And I think, one of the takeaways from the study, which I'm not comfortable with, is it suggests there's limits to the amount of prejudice people have because we've reached the heights of that and now it's been declining. So despite Donald Trump, they would argue it's been a decline, even though they're hearing all about it in social media and everywhere else. So I have a little bit of problem reconciling that with what intuitively feels like what's really going on.
Although one of the interesting things that I think that they found by studying this over time is that these beliefs that we thought were solid and could not be changed are in fact malleable. We are all inundated with lots of data and information, and we have such easy access to so much of it. But how do we make sense of it all? Well, today we're joined by Scott Page, who is professor of complex systems, political science, and economics at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. Scott, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here.
When I'm in kind of casual get-togethers and people ask me, what I do, I kind of hesitate to say pollster because that can be a real conversation stopper. What is a professor of complex systems, and what does it mean to be teaching that sort of stuff?
It's a great question. So complex systems are systems that consist of diverse entities that interact, and what happens kind of through those interactions, kind of at the macro level, is fundamentally different than what's going on in the parts. So the brain would be a good example, right? So there's neurons and axons and dendrites, but then through the interactions of those things, you get personality, cognition, that sort of stuff, right? Same is true of a society, right? Each of us gets up each day and puts on clothes and drinks coffee and then goes to work and does what we do, and that produces an economy, a political environment, it produces a culture. But none of those things can only be found within any one person. They're really collective phenomena, they're emergent phenomena. And so what people who study complex systems do is we study diversity, we study networks, we study interactions, and we try and understand what's going on can we understand what's going on at the macro level by looking at what's going on at the micro level.
So your latest book, you are also an author, is The Model Thinker, What You Need to Know to Make Data Work for You. You also, in addition to the book, this is a subject of a Coursera MOOC, which actually boasts a pretty sizable current student enrollment, and I believe has been taken by over 500,000 people. So what exactly does it mean to be a model thinker?
Right, so the idea is that to make sense of the world, we construct simple models, right? So if you take a physics class, right, you write force equals mass times acceleration, right? So what we do is we use models to sort of...
Yeah, I do that all
every
the time.
day, right? So and there's a difference between like saying, well, the bigger something is and the harder I throw it, the more damage it can do, and actually having the equation in a way, right? Or if you take a statistics class, you might sort of like make formal hypotheses and that sort of stuff. And when the federal government decides should we raise interest rates or not, or the Federal Market Committee does, they use these macroeconomic models. So any class you take in college now will probably have some sort of model in it. And what the book is about in a way is that when the world is incredibly complex, when lots of stuff going on, there's a disconnect in that models are simple. So you can't explain something complex with one simple thing. So what you kind of have to do is apply a lot of models. And so what you do is the fundamental theme of the book is kind of what I call many model thinking, is to sort of cope with complexity and leverage all this amazing data we've got to use a whole bunch of different sort of formal lenses to make sense of it.
And how does that play out in everyday real world life? There are 600,000 people who have taken this course. There aren't 600,000 people who have taken it because it doesn't have some real world application, right, to how we live. How does this play out for people who aren't, working in complex systems as an educational kind of thing?
So I think the reason there's been such interest in the course, and trust me, this has been a total surprise to me and my publisher and everybody else, right? Yeah, it's 500-page
Happy
book.
surprises are
Yeah,
good.
that's right.
So
No,
congratulations.
especially, well, it's more the case that, it really can't come away with this anything but a really positive outlook at the world to think that many people are interested in understanding the world better. So let me give a very specific example that kind of comes at the end of the book. If you look at something like inequality, you could say, oh, this is all being driven by winner-take-all technology, right? Or you might say it's all being driven by the fact that there's some power elite that's sort of extracted power. But the reality is there's all sorts of different explanations. Like a lot of it's actually driven by assortative mating. People now date later. So it used to be like, 25 years ago, my wife married me just because I was cute. Now she'd have waited to see how much money I'd make to marry.
Well, actually, it was probably a good bet.
That's right. But before you kind of had to make the bet before you knew kind of what someone was going to do. So that people are marrying.
But it was
people.
just a higher probability.
That's right. So now people are kind of marrying people in the same income class, and that contributes. And so there's a wonderful book by a guy named Phil Tetlock called Expert Political Judgment, where he talks about foxes and hedgehogs. And hedgehogs are people who have a single model. And these tend to be the people who end up on TV and radio, because they have a single view of how the world works. So it's kind of Al Franken and Rush Limbaugh. And what he showed by evaluating thousands, literally tens of thousands of predictions, that those people are actually worse than random. That if you look at the world through one lens, you're just not very smart. I mean, this goes back to Aristotle, right? Many hands, many feet, that sort of thing. What he called the wisdom of the multitudes. And if you look at the world through a lot of models, or at least 4 or 5 models, you're just more likely to be kind of smart, right? To just make more accurate predictions, make wiser choices. So, if you're going to buy a house, you might think, okay, well, let me compute the price per square foot. That's one model, right? You might sort of do projections based on the city plan of where the city's going to grow. That's, another model, right? So there's any decision you make, you're just going to make a wiser choice if you frame it in multiple ways.
Isn't this exactly what machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms are, though? Is the opportunity to have not 4 or 5 models, but 1,000 models, if you have them, thrown at one problem to try and figure out the best answer?
Absolutely. So some of the stuff, like some of the techniques that were like the hot techniques, like 5 years ago, like random forest, literally were like you construct like 40 different simple models and kind of averaging them up, right? And it's true if you look at sort of the deep learning things that are going on now, kind of you could think of the hidden layers inside those things as kind of being models that are being aggregated. But the thing is, those models themselves can only go based on past data, right? All data looks backwards. And so in addition to sort of heavily database models, you also want to have, models that are maybe based on, variables that you may have to just estimate out of thin air. So if for example, if I produce a new car and I want to know like how many am I going to sell, or a new printer, or a new set of earbuds or something, I can only use past data on the features that exist in the current product. If there's some new feature, I may not know, right? And then I've got to sort of like construct some sort of model about, what the potential impact of that will be, right? So, yeah, they're good. Big data is good, but there's also, it's got its limits.
Does anything defy modeling?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I talk about in the book is like the syntopicon, right? That the Great Books movement had a list of what they called, the 100 and some, or 1,000 and some great ideas that everyone should know. And you can just go down that list. This is, Mortimer Adler and Hutchins at the University of Chicago with the whole Great Books movement. And so there's things like risk, which, yep, I can model that. There's things like trust, like, yep, I can model that. Then there's things like love. It's like, nope. So you just gotta, some of them are pretty binary, like, yep, that's gonna be modelable, no, that's not. But then other stuff kind of lies in between. And one of the things that's really, I think, fantastic is the exercise of trying to model something or model something in multiple ways, like, what really is risk or what really is information, gives you a deeper understanding. And you also see the limits of, what what models will give you.
So this poll hub, this podcast is called Poll Hub,
Yeah.
and that's because we're pollsters. So on a purely selfish note, what in the model thinkers and in what you've thought about in the way that that people use many models, what could pollsters take away from this? What can we learn? Because at the end of the day, we're just selfish.
Yeah. So one of the things I think that comes from the book that's really important is there's a chapter on sort of distributions, right? Where you think, I think pollsters have this predilection to think of, everything's going to be a normal distribution because I'm getting a bunch of independent draws, right? And once you start having interactions between the, individuals or variables, that independence can go away. And when independence goes away, you move from sort of a nice bell curve to what people will call sort of long tail distributions, where bigger events can happen. And it also means that the distribution could move much faster than you might have thought it could move otherwise, right? And so I think that there's just deeply engaging and asking yourself, where do these distributions come from, I think is really important. I think the other thing that comes out of the model that's, really a lot of fun is to think about, there's really 4 things that can be true of data. Things can be kind of an equilibrium. Things can be following some sort of pattern. Things can be just completely random, or things can be complex. And we often don't even ask ourselves that question. We just measure something, but we don't ask, are we measuring something that's just a random sequence of stuff? Is it a simple pattern, or is it complex? The other thing I think from a pollster standpoint that I really stress, and this is kind of in some sense, one of the core foundations of the book, is something called the wisdom hierarchy. That at the very bottom is data, right? At the very bottom is, and data, when I think of data, I think of literally the things you kind of observe in the world. And what pollsters do is they turn that data into information. That's the next level in the hierarchy. And then above information is knowledge, which is understanding relationships. So now I've got all this data that says women are more likely to vote than men, or older people are more likely to vote, right? So that's information, but then that information can be turned into knowledge, which is that means then that women and older people may have more power within the political system. Wisdom then consists of sort of multiple knowledges, right? And sort of combining that knowledge and thinking which is appropriate in this setting. And so I think for pollsters, what's important to know is a lot of what you're doing is you're turning data into information. And then you want to ask, am I producing the information that's going to allow people to be knowledgeable and then eventually wise?
So you contend that people look at data today pretty much the same way that we have, in the past, 2 decades. Right. How might we change that?
Oh, I think how things are going to change is we're going to have a much more sort of temporal view of data, right? I think in the past, because we didn't have as much of it, there was much more sort of snapshotty data, right? I think also we're going to use data to keep ourselves honest. 30 years ago, I could get up and say something like, there's much more interest in the concept of equity than there has been in the last 30 years. I could just bloviate and pontificate and no one could check me. Now, if I say something like that when I'm lecturing to undergraduates, they can just type into Google Ngram, right, and see that I'm absolutely full of crap. Or that I'm saying that because I typed it into Google Ngram earlier in the day and I'm totally comfortable with it. No, so there's all these checks, right? And let me be honest about I think one reason the course has resonated at the University of Michigan, and one reason why it's resonated on Coursera and the book is sold so well, is that when I went to college at the University of Michigan, and I'm from a place called Yankee Springs, Michigan, the card catalog room at the university was bigger than any library I'd ever been in, right? And I thought holy cow, this is my moment. This is my one time to touch and see all this information, all this knowledge, right? Now it's all on my phone, right? So all this data is
and
there.
And more.
I know.
Yeah, more than that. Every library, every card catalog
Yeah.
in every library in the history of the world, more or less.
And maybe we can have a picture of what that is
and
on,
so the thing is,
Facebook.
And so the point is that hopefully I'm going to have some models to help me organize it in some way. Even just this idea of, putting things in categories is sort of useful, right? And so it's, I think that what's going to happen is people are going to be using frameworks and models and structures to create decision aids, thought aids, that sort of stuff. And if you look at Wolfram Alpha is a great example. I mean, Stephen was just visiting us in Ann Arbor, and the guy who's created Mathematica, and Wolfram Alpha, I think in like 5 or 10 years, you're just be able to type anything in there, and it'll like give you, regression outputs and polls and data and aggregate things in an amazing way. Google might be able to do the same thing, but I think we're going to just see the sort of automation of the data that's out there that enables us, that keeps us honest in ways that we wouldn't have been before.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for joining us and giving us some insight into what a model thinker is. That's the title of your book, as well as the subject of a big Coursera course that you've put together. And, of course, you also teach at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. That's where my nephew went, so, there's some good there.
Awesome. I hope he looks good in blue.
He does. Yes, he does, and he's in Denver now. He graduated a few years ago, but he follows Michigan, especially basketball more than football for whatever reason. But he follows it very closely and goes to a University of Michigan bar in Denver, a sports bar in Denver, Michigan bar, to watch the games. So hey,
there you go.
There you go. Anyway, thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it, and for all your insights.
Thanks a lot. Have a nice day.
And that'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Our executive producer, as always, Mary Griffith. Thank you for all that you do for us.
And we also depend a lot on the Roper Center Archives at Cornell University. I'm a member of the board. We're going to have our annual meeting real soon, and we're doing really well at the Roper Center, and it's very helpful in putting together the trend data for this podcast, too.
And if you have a question that you would like us to answer, you can email us directly at pollhub@marist.edu, or check us out and, give us a holler on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, pretty much any platform. And wherever you're listening to this, please don't forget to subscribe.